Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation as part of the 2020 conference for the Association of Recovery Schools, Association of Recovery in Higher Education and the Association of Alternative Peer Groups. My name is Olivia Pinelli and I'll be your host today. The topic of today's presentation is Abstinence vs Non-Abstinence, Endorsing a Non-Abstinence-Based Approach for Eating Disorder Recovery in an Abstinence-Based Substance Use Disorder Collegiate Recovery Program. And I'm joined by Diana Monsour and Michelle Cowan. Just a few reminders before we start. The presentation will be recorded and it'll be uploaded to YouTube. It will be on a private link, so anybody that is registered for the presentation, for the conference, and is presenting will be able to access that link. We'll provide it to you. We ask that you don't share that with anyone that's not registered unless you have our explicit consent. Conference sessions are also approved by a number of continuing education providers. Just check our website, and if you've got any questions about that, email conference@collegiaterecovery.org. Thanks for joining us today. Now, before I turn it over to you both, I wanted to read a quick bio. Diana is a PhD candidate and a research associate at Texas Tech University. In 2017, Diana graduated with her master's in counselor education. Diana specializes in substance use disorders, eating disorders, and co-occurring mental health issues. Michelle is a PhD candidate and composition instructor in technical communication and rhetoric at Texas Tech University. Michelle uses her research and her 15 years in recovery to help others understand eating disorders and craft their recovery journeys. I hope I've done your bios some justice, so I'm going to turn it over to you two.
Hi, thank you for that introduction and welcome to our presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you with a conceptual understanding in how we view eating disorder recovery. We're hoping that you can take this understanding of eating disorder recovery and apply it to your collegiate recovery programs to help support your students who are struggling with eating disorders, disordered eating, or just trying to navigate some sort of eating disorder recovery. And Olivia already did a great introduction for us, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about my perspective. I am a doctoral student and I work with students who are in recovery for both substance use disorder and eating disorders. And so I have the research perspective, the clinical perspective, and then I also have my own recovery. And so I'm hoping with all of that experience, I can provide you with some useful information today.
Yes, and I'm Michelle, and I bring a little bit of a different perspective because I come from the Communication Studies Department, Technical Communication and Rhetoric, and Diana's going to go give us a great background on everything, and then we'll get into some of the research I've been doing into recovery narratives and the stories people tell about their recovery, and then we'll get into our own stories of recovery to finish.
And these are the objectives we included in our proposal, and that's pretty much the outline for this presentation today. I'm going to go over the research. We're going to analyze the differences between substance use disorders and eating disorder recovery, and then we're going to spend some time talking about our own personal stories. According to the National Eating Disorder Association, eating disorders are serious but treatable mental and physical illnesses. Eating disorders occur on a spectrum from mild, moderate to severe. The most well-known and well-researched eating disorders are anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Some other newer concepts in the fields are food addiction, disordered eating, and orthorexia. Most individuals fit under the category of other specified eating disorder known as OSFED, formerly known as EDNOS, and disordered eating. So a lot of students won't have a formal diagnosis, and that can be confusing when trying to figure out if they need formal support. And so we help them navigate that process too. So some facts about eating disorders are at least 30 million people of all ages and genders suffer from an eating disorder at some point, in their lifetime. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, and eating disorders affect all races and ethnic groups. There are genetics, environmental factors, and personality traits that contribute to the risks of eating disorders, but some personality traits are specific to each eating disorder, so it makes it difficult to study them as an entire population. So because we are talking about eating disorder recovery in the context of a substance use disorder community, I wanted to go ahead and provide the definition of substance use disorders and how we're looking at it. The American Society of Addiction Medicine reported that substance use disorders are a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, and memory-related circuitry. Substance use disorders are reinforced by disrupting the brain's natural reward system by prioritizing substance use above all other survival needs, such as food, sex, and safety. We know there's a strong biological component and genetic factors that influence substance use disorders, but the chronic use of substances have the power to rewire the brain, resulting in a strong biological and behavioral compulsion to use substances despite severe consequences. So there's a combination of biological and environmental influences that contribute to substance use disorders. And because substance use disorders are considered a chronic brain disease, it requires a continuum of care approach. And there's a lot of research that supports that. So to dive a little bit deeper into the psychological traits that predict substance use disorders, research shows that they have low harm avoidance and high novelty seeking, which is impulsivity and high risk-taking behaviors. And it's also associated with negative affect, which are the negative emotions like resentment, fear, guilt, shame, despair, which is paired with low self-concept. So how are substance use disorders and eating disorders related? Anorexia is reported to be the least compatible with substance use disorders because they are associated with low levels of impulsivity and high levels of persistence. Researchers show that women with anorexia may engage in substances initially as an effort to lose weight, whereas women with bulimia may turn to drugs or alcohol to subdue bulimic urges. So substance use disorders, bulimia, and binge eating disorder are highly correlated due to genetic factors that reduce due to the genetic factors, and because they're using both of these disorders to reduce the negative affect and suppress urges. And then some studies show that substance use disorders and eating disorders act on similar receptors in the brain. And so I've included these infographics in every presentation that I've done about eating disorders and collegiate recovery programs. And this is just to kind of put it in perspective and how many people may be struggling with eating disorders in the community. 50% of individuals with eating disorders abuse substances, and 35% of individuals with substance use disorders statistically have eating disorders. So in our collegiate recovery community, we have over 100 students. And so in a population of 100 students with substance use disorders, statistically 35 of them might struggle with an eating disorder. And then we know that college students are at higher risk for having eating disorders. And then we know people with substance use disorders are at higher risk for having eating disorders. So we're dealing with a population that are extremely likely to struggle with eating disorders. So we definitely need to be considering providing this type of support to students, and understanding recovery and how to talk about recovery is really important. And then the next graphic on the right just shows some substances that people with substance use disorders and eating disorders are likely to abuse, which are substances that suppress the appetite. I hear from a lot of students that caffeine and tobacco are used to suppress appetite, even with students that don't identify with having disordered eating or an eating disorder will say they don't want to give up smoking because they're afraid of the weight gain associated with it, because supposedly gaining weight is a bad thing. And that's also goes to show that gaining weight can be an emotionally challenging thing for people in substance use disorder recovery. And so that's something that we have to attend to with students in substance use disorder recovery. Okay, so are eating disorders addictions? The purpose of this slide is to discuss eating disorders in the context of addictions, because I think it's natural for people in the substance use disorder field to want to compare eating disorders to substance use disorders. And so when conceptualizing eating disorders as addictions, researchers are looking at compulsive eating behaviors, most likely associated with binge eating or bulimia nervosa. And research shows different reasons for addictive-like eating. One of the reasons is highly likely to be the restrictive eating that's associated with dieting. And that's kind of what this, this image shows on the right. The days isn't anything specific, it's just a graphic I found when looking for images. But it just goes to show that when restricting something like sugar for a long period of time, human studies and rat studies show that it leads to compulsively eating that substance later. And then addictive eating is also associated with reward dysfunction in the brain. So there's certain chemicals in the brain that can lead people to compulsively overeat. And then there's also a significant amount of researchers that believe that food in and of itself is addicting. So highly palatable foods and sugar, which is a very controversial subject, with a lot of studies being biased. And so it leads to really confusing and conflicting research. A lot of researchers prefer to use the term eating addiction instead of food addiction, because they wholeheartedly believe there is nothing wrong with the food, and food in and of itself is not addicting. And believing food is addicting is harmful to individuals with eating disorders, because treatment involves learning that food is not addicting. And so there isn't any really good treatment interventions for food addiction. Some of the treatment includes medications, which can help reduce the need to overeat, but it hasn't really helped with the underlying psychopathology that causes people to overeat. Other treatment interventions include reducing exposure to addictive foods, which is abstinence. And then on the other hand, it's reducing dieting. And so a lot of them are conflicting with each other. There aren't any good treatment outcomes, which leads to weight stigma and weight bias, because there seems to be this personal responsibility attached to weight. Weight stigma and weight bias are issues that desperately needs to be addressed. And we're actually going to be addressing that in a totally different webinar coming up in the future months. So I don't want to say that that's not important and we're not going to talk about it here, but it's something we can talk about in a different presentation. So moving on to the next slide. This is a different perspective that most eating disorder professionals choose to take, especially since research shows that dieting and restricting certain foods are risk factors for all types of eating disorders. So eating disorder professionals have adopted intuitive eating and HAES principles. HAES stands for Health at Every Size. These are very well-known concepts as best practices in the eating disorder field. These principles endorse ideas such as rejecting diet mentality, honoring your hunger, make peace with food, respecting your body, engaging in meaningful movement, and just honoring your health. The Health at Every Size principles were created by the Association for Size and Diversity as a social advocacy response to healthcare, and really endorsing this idea of not using size as a proxy for health. And so the eating disorder profession has really taken this social justice stance on food addiction, because food addiction is oftentimes associated with obesity and overweight individuals, because there's this weight bias in the medical field saying like it's not okay to live in a larger body. And oftentimes these issues intersect with other forms of marginalization like racism, sexism, classism, sizeism, because not everyone has access to healthy, organic diet foods that you see perpetuated and embedded in our culture. And so that's just something I want to mention here, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail. With these conflicting paradigms of like food addiction and this perspective here, we have this controversial, conflicting paradigm, and we don't really know where to intervene, because one is about the food and one is not about the food. And since in classic eating disorder treatment doesn't really acknowledge the gravity of addictive processes. So even though we're trying to stay away from the idea that food is addicting and we want to liberalize the diet and help people make peace with food, there are a significant amount of people that are struggling with this addiction-like response to food. And so they're struggling with this message that is inconsistent with their experiences. And so we still want to be able to honor that and help them make peace with food, especially in the context of a substance use disorder community where they may be adopting an abstinence-based approach to substances that are in and of themselves addicting. And so we're trying to help them reconcile not only the conflicting, confusing messages in the food and eating disorder community, but within a collegiate recovery program where they may be addicted to substances, but the food, not so much. And so the purpose of helping them find an eating disorder recovery program is to help them acknowledge the messages that no longer serve them and find a program that works for them. And so moving on to the next slide is, how do we define eating disorder recovery? And in the field, we obviously don't have a consistent definition of recovery, and we don't have a meaningful way to compare recovery across studies. So we can't really look to the field for one superior definition of how to define recovery for our collegiate recovery program. And not only that, most studies are short-term, which are 6 months to 1 year, that measure recovery in terms of abstinence, which is based on physical criteria such as its BMI in a normal healthy range, and then the abstinence of binging, purging, or restricted eating. And so the problem with that is it shows that a lot of people aren't recovering from their eating disorder because a lot of people aren't able to abstain from these behaviors from 6 months to 1 year. And then when especially since the longitudinal studies show that people do fully recover, but it takes a longer amount of time. It can take up to 5 to 7 years for some people, and in severe and enduring cases, such as severe and enduring anorexia, some people even took up to 22 years to fully recover, but they still fully recovered, and full recovery is possible. But if we're only basing recovery on these physical, like abstinence of symptoms, then we're discounting the fact that they can recover. And so we try not to define recovery in our recovery community as abstinence of binging, purging, and restricted eating, because we want to help them navigate this process of recovery so we can get them to full recovery. And especially since qualitative researchers have shown psychological well-being is a significant factor in individuals who have fully recovered. And so moving on to the next slide, the dimensions of psychological and physical recovery included self-acceptance, positive relationships with others, personal growth, and it included a remission of symptoms, eventually, self-adaptability and autonomy. And so these are all things that we want to empower our students and clients to aim for in their eating disorder recovery. And in the next slide, I just included a few concepts in the literature about multiple pathways of recovery. And I acknowledge that there may be many more concepts and many more pathways than this. This is just to show that not everyone experiences the full continuum of care or identifies with 12-step culture when it comes to recovery. And it's important to create a community that recognizes all pathways. So for example, you may have somebody in your community that utilizes a professional treatment team as their primary recovery program, which would include a therapist, a registered dietitian, and a medical doctor. And then someone on the other hand may be just 12 steps, like that was their way of finding recovery and that's all they need for their recovery program. And that's okay. We don't want to say one is better than the other based on our own personal experiences or our own biases. In these processes that I mentioned, these aren't meant to be distinct groups. In fact, some research shows that natural recovery is relational in many ways, and so a lot of these overlaps. And so these are just concepts that are mentioned in the research, and I'm sure many students can identify in many categories. And so this next slide is here because we are integrating eating disorder recovery in a substance use disorder recovery community, which means we have to create an environment that recognizes, respects, and supports both types of recovery. And so these are the most cited definitions of recovery in the literature. And just like eating disorders, there is not a superior definition of substance use disorder recovery, but it seems that SAMHSA's definition is the one that most people are citing, which is a process of change through which people improve their health and wellness and live self-directed lives and strive to reach their full potential. And Best and Laudet highlight that most definitions include some component of well-being or quality of life and some measure of community engagement or citizenship and some measure of sobriety. And so pathways are highly personal and generally involve a redefinition of identity in the face of a crisis. And furthermore, pathways are often socially grounded in cultural beliefs or traditions and involve informal community resources and provide support for sobriety. The pathway to recovery may include one or more episodes of psychosocial and or pharmacological treatment. And for some, recovery involves neither treatment nor involvement with mutual aid groups, which are 12-step groups. Recovery is a process of change that permits an individual to make healthy choices and improve their quality of life. And so most researchers do agree that abstinence-based recovery is considered a lifelong process. And so turning to what experts in the collegiate recovery field say, they acknowledge that conversations and controversies surrounding the definition of recovery highlights how little we still know about recovery generally. And this can be applied to eating disorder recovery as well. And so it's vital for us to study the experiences of the students in our program to explain how they are staying in recovery over time. But it's also important to acknowledge that our students who are adopting an abstinence-based program are faced with unique challenges. One of those being that having a safe space in a abstinence hostile environment is important. And so moving on to the next slide this is why we choose to define abstinence in our program. This is why we choose to define recovery in our program as abstinence from alcohol and drugs, regardless if you're there for a behavioral addiction and eating disorder, because we want it to be safe for everybody. And then we also require them to be actively seeking recovery in a non-abstinence-based behavioral addiction if they're there for their eating disorder or that behavioral addiction. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Michelle so she can explain how people talk about their specific recovery programs.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. Again, I approach addiction and recovery from a little bit different perspective because I am in communication studies. I'm really interested in the language people use to describe their recovery process and how that language can maybe influence others or influences themselves and how they recover. So that's kind of what my research centers around. I am a member of the Collegiate Recovery Community at Texas Tech also, so I will be speaking to that too. Most of what I've been studying lately have been kind of in two camps. I've been doing close readings of oral stories from Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and Eating Disorders Anonymous, as well as doing like a higher level computational text analysis of 30 oral stories. And I'm continuing to build on that number of stories. So my research is still ongoing. So some of the stuff I'll share with you today is still in progress. But I'm hoping to build on this corpus of 30 stories so I can get more and more valid data to go off of. So what am I looking for in my research? It's how do people move from short-term to long-term recovery? That's a main issue that I'm interested in. And also, what are the differences between substance use and eating disorder recovery? And what tools do people in long-term recovery use that we can transfer on to people in our recovery communities? How can we teach people, how can we give people what they need to move through those early years through to a long-term sustained recovery? So long-term versus short-term recovery is important to me for many of the reasons that Diana already mentioned, just because substance use disorder and eating disorders are often not covered past, even 6 months to 1 year, and definitely few people are followed past 3 years. Relapse rates are high within those first 3 years. So like, how can we get people beyond that? And it's just very important for us to make sure that we're attending to this in our communities. The initial close readings of the stories that I've been looking at of people in recovery do reveal a pattern for people in long-term recovery. And this is based on initial close readings of people from those varieties of 12-step programs. So from AA, NA to OA and EDA. So that pattern that I've started seeing by doing these sort of close examinations of people's own tellings of their recovery stories is that, number one, they come into the 12-step community and immediately they're identifying differences and or similarities between themselves and other group members. So when they come into a 12-step community, this is happening. I believe this is probably also happening in our collegiate recovery communities too, and almost any community that we enter, that we're looking at differences, we're looking at similarities, we're kind of assessing where we are and where people in the group are. Number two, people coming in realize they are not terminally unique. So they start to realize that, oh, maybe I do have more in common with these people, or maybe there are things that I'm not, just out here on my own working with. I can actually maybe discard some of these things that I think are totally unique to me and start moving toward a different kind of identity or a different kind of life. So step three is after they start kind of discarding these things from the past that maybe aren't working so well for them, they start using the group identity and the program norms to stitch together their identity. So they're adopting group norms in place of things that no longer serve them or that they've decided they want to leave behind. The critical shift that seems to happen is between stage 3 and stage 4. Stage 3, they're adopting the group identity, but at some point, people in long-term recovery clearly begin a lifelong process of continually inventing and reinventing their own approaches to recovery so that they can sort of build their own identities as individuals and still live within these communities of recovery, but have their own individual approach. So it's important to remember that this fourth step seems to be common among substance use disorders and eating disorders. So people starting out with an abstinence-based group identity that might be very rigid and very clearly structured, a lot of people in long-term recovery seem to move to something that is much more personalized and customized. I'm not going to spend too long on these. I have a couple slides on a couple of communication scholars that have looked at addiction and also community group behavior. Kenneth Burke is just a person that talks about addiction as association and about recovery as the process of breaking certain associations and reassociating things with other things. So, you know, old patterns start becoming reassociated with new ideas. And then Diane Davis has studied communities, and she looks at how there's this tension between being an individual and being part of the group, and that how we really define ourselves as individuals is often based on differences between us and other people in the group, but yet there is still this deep longing and also deep realization that we are still one with the group. So in communication studies, a lot of people study this, in rhetoric especially, you know, how are we individuating ourselves and how are we also being one with the group? And so these recovery stories that I look at really show that struggle within people, and I think this is going on in our recovery communities, or collegiate recovery communities too. So that first stage that I talked about is about both similarity and difference. So over here on the left, you know, people talk about, okay, they might come into an eating disorder program and maybe their issue is binge eating disorder or bulimia or something like that. And they're like, not eating is not my problem. Like, I don't relate to these anorexic people. I don't relate to these problems. So they might have that response. They might say, hey, those people are different from me. I'm not sure if I fit in. They might call them weirdos, things like that. And these are quotes from the stories that I've been studying. Over here on the right, other people come in and they say, hey, I feel like I came home. I feel like people understand me. They have similar patterns. Other people who have studied 12-step communities and other kinds of communities often say that personal differences are aggressively ignored in 12-step communities in the beginning. But the important thing is that no matter whether somebody comes in with the, hey, I'm nothing like these people, or if they come in saying, I'm so like these people, both of these individuals can recover and achieve long-term recovery. So that's the important thing about that first stage. The thing I want to really examine and question is this move from stage 3 to stage 4. So adopting that group identity and then moving toward the creation of one's own identity. Because what happens if I am in an abstinence-based recovery program for substance use or something else, and I have decided I'm letting go of these old associations and I'm going to adopt this group identity of abstinence first. It's the most important part of my recovery. Make sure that I do that. And then at the same time, maybe I realize I have an eating disorder, or I'm already in treatment for an eating disorder or something like that. And they're telling me, oh, no foods are bad. You need to release control of how you feel about food. How am I supposed to reconcile these two different approaches and get to this place where I can sort of reinvent my own identity? Like, which group identity am I going to adopt? And how am I going to then move toward creating my own identity? Because a lot of people need the stability of a group identity to really get their feet on the ground before they can start being more creative about their recovery. So it's like, which group identity am I going to identify with? So we've been calling this, Diana and I, the multiple program problem. So if I have multiple programs, what do I do? Am I left, like, if one is abstinence-based, am I just left with knowing that the way I was living my life was wrong and I need to figure out some new way of living my life, and I can't figure out whether I should be putting more rules in, putting fewer rules in, following this group, following the other group? So it's very, very challenging, and we have not been able to answer this problem. But in this presentation, we want to present what does work for people with eating disorders, so that even if we're in an abstinence-based context, like a lot of collegiate recovery communities, we can learn how to help people with eating disorders more effectively within those environments. So what works for us? Well, to kind of discover what works for people with eating disorders, I have been studying stories from people who've recovered through Overeaters Anonymous. And the reason I picked this group is because Overeaters Anonymous, some people in Overeaters Anonymous use an abstinence-based approach where they see things like sugar, flour, or certain foods, or adherence to a relatively strict food plan as essential definitions of their abstinence. And then there are other people in Overeaters Anonymous who maybe don't even have a food plan, no foods are bad, they have a much looser definition and maybe don't even talk about abstinence. Like they may be a loose definition of abstinence or they don't even talk about it. So I wanted to study this group to see, which approaches are resulting in the most long-term success. And of course, by looking at these individual stories, it's very clear that different things work for different individuals and that a lot of individuals need a stricter approach in the beginning in order to get going. But further research into what people are saying as they get past that 6-year recovery mark really start to show us differences. So there's also a lot of spoken narratives from Overeaters Anonymous available through the Overeaters Anonymous Los Angeles intergroup online. So the stories that I'm studying are publicly available and have been I've been studying them through text analysis, computational text analysis, and also from a psycholinguistic lens. So that means I'm basically transcribing these oral stories. I chose oral stories because they're not edited as much, and I've been looking at them, through word count, word correlations, and also different. I'll talk a little bit more about the psycholinguistic approach in a second. But through these stories that I've started analyzing, just this initial group of 30, and I'm hoping to add more over the next year. I will add more over the next year. One thing I want to mention in the context of this presentation is that people with 6 or more years of recovery mention abstinence less. So I divided the group into people who have been in recovery for 2 or fewer years and people who have been in recovery for 6 or more years. I tried to kind of weed out that 3 to 5 year stage of recovery because it seemed like in the stories that I was hearing and interviews that I've done, it's around that time that people seem to say their recovery shifted or there was a difference. And so I kind of wanted to take out a murky middle area. So I compared people with 6 or more years of recovery with people with 2 or less. And so people with 6 or more definitely mention things like abstinence less. They also use less rigid language. And they also, they mention food a little bit less, not a ton less than people who have been in recovery for less time, but they are definitely mentioning abstinence less. So they don't mention it not at all, but this is just an initial finding. I also did a psycholinguistic analysis using linguistic inquiry and word count. The linguistic inquiry and word count method developed by James Pennebaker. And that's been used in several studies to analyze content words, style words, and other patterns of speech and writing to assess different psychological characteristics like self-centeredness, social orientation, drive, emotions, things like that. So let me just go ahead and let you know what I found. Okay, so long timers, so people with 6 or more years seem to exhibit more positive emotion and also have more focus on the present. They have less negative emotion in their words and less focus on the past, which, I mean, yeah, they have less focus on the past and less on negative emotion, similar to what Diana was talking about, how when people are in addictions, when people are in early recovery, they tend to have a negative affect, they tend to be focused on the negative, and hopefully as one gets to long-term recovery, you would have more positive emotions, so that's a good thing to see. Also, long-timers exhibit more causal and insight language, and more causal and insight language is associated with better health outcomes. So a couple of studies by Pennebaker and also by a couple of his associates, and then a couple of other people that aren't even associated with him, have, and I have those references at the end, have found that more causal and insight language seems to be associated with better health outcomes and better mental health and actual better physical health as well. They also these long-timers use more tentative language and less affiliation-related language. And that's really relevant for this presentation because tentative language suggests that they have a greater tolerance for ambiguity. less rigidity in their thinking, they're more apt to not say this is right or wrong or always or never, or there's more nuance to the speech when they're using more tentative language. And interestingly, even though they've been in this 12-step program longer, they have less affiliation related language. So they're able to talk a little bit more about maybe their personal approach as opposed to just absorbing and spitting out group norms. So that is really kind of an indication that there's a tolerance for ambiguity and for a variety of ways of thinking about things. Also interesting is that people with long-term recovery talk more about their mental drives and less about food, health, or the body. So they're more concerned with their thinking and psychology and less about food, health, or body, which jives again with what Diana was saying about how experts see that eating disorders should be thought of more as about maybe behaviors and thinking and cognition, and less about sort of these external factors, maybe like food and body size. So these conclusions, just like I said, long-timers tend to describe their thinking in less rigid terms. They tend to mention abstinence and food less. They tend to be less concerned about group norms. They focus more on cognition and the brain. So more research definitely needs to be done on how people can develop these kinds of ways of thinking in an abstinence-centric context. Again, a lot of people do start out with a strict sort of abstinence or rigid approach to recovery, but eventually it's key to move on to that fourth stage of inventing things for yourself and being tolerant of maybe there not being one right way to recover. So that's very important. The challenges for this study so far, of course, is that this initial sample is very small, but I am going to be adding to it. Also, the narratives that I'm talking about are informed by the 12-step context in which they're told. So if I just got people who were not using 12-step approaches and analyzed their stories, I'm not sure how different they would be. So that's something I'm interested in looking at. But also this study really shows that one thing that needs to be defined a little bit better is relapse. Like, how do we define relapse with eating disorders? It's a little bit more straightforward in substance use, because if I use or if I drink, then I have broken my abstinence. With eating disorders, that can be very confusing for people, because what if I binge but I don't purge? Or what if I, just am having a lot of thoughts? Or what if I'm just doing a lot of body checking more than usual? Have I relapsed? Have I slipped? What is this? And should I measure the length of my recovery since a relapse, or should it be since I first entered recovery? And similar with substance use, even if maybe I relapse with my substance, do I then have to think about my recovery from the last time I used, or can I think about it from when I first was introduced to recovery? So those are things that also need to continue to be looked at. For our collegiate recovery communities, many of our people that we're working with are in short-term recovery. Like, they haven't been in recovery very long. Some people have, but a lot of them are new to recovery. And, if we're trying to get them into this into this place where they're not so reliant on an abstinence-based, strictly defined concept of recovery, can we actually develop that within the couple of years that they're in our communities? And how can we do that? What language or ideas can we use to sort of model for people so that they can move toward long-term recovery? So for people with eating disorders, if everything in the community is all about abstinence, is that really helping them? Can we use less rigid language? And then also, if people are embedded in that abstinence model, how can we still support their substance use recovery while supporting eating disorder recovery? Because we don't want to undermine the centrality of abstinence for substance use recovery. We don't want to say, oh, it's okay that if you go out and drink, because maybe it's not. So we don't want to undermine what people are doing, especially if they're in multiple programs. So how can we address these concerns? And so I think Diana is going to talk a little bit more about that and her personal story dealing with multiple programs as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I think she captured the challenges very well, and I'm hoping to be able to bring that to life in my personal story, because I am in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder and an eating disorder, and a lot of these challenges that we're experiencing in a multiple program, Collegiate Recovery Program, are some things that I had to reconcile within myself as I navigated both of these recoveries. And so I'm going to be a little vulnerable and talk about my personal experience, which I don't know how I feel about doing in a recording on a webinar, but I'm going to do that for the sake of helping other people learn. And so on January 6, 2013 was the day that I entered into recovery for my substance use disorder. And at that time, I was in denial of the fact that I had some lingering eating disorder issues because I was no longer engaging in eating disorder behaviors. So I felt like that was the day that I entered into recovery, and none of those things were going to be issues for me anymore. But for the first 9 months of my recovery, I began to adopt really rigid ways of thinking and behaving out of fear of returning back to eating disorder behaviors. So I started to restrict certain foods out of fear of going back to eating disorder behaviors. And I began to feel like the only way I could really describe it is that I was a prisoner in my own body, because I couldn't eat certain foods. I couldn't hang out with certain people. I couldn't go out to dinner after meetings because I never really resolved the underlying thinking in my eating disorder. And the more I started to adopt abstinence in my eating disorder, the worse I got. And it wasn't until October, which was around 9 months in my substance use disorder recovery, did I realize like I was experiencing freedom like I never knew, because I was no longer drinking or using drugs, which is that is freedom because of how awful my substance use disorder was. But then after 9 months of being still stuck in these old ways of thinking and behaving and not being able to experience freedom in other aspects of my life, I realized I needed to take more action. And I'm grateful for my recovery and working the 12 steps, because it taught me that. And I was at a all recovery meeting at our Collegiate Recovery Program. It's called Celebration of Recovery. And they had a speaker that night, and she was actually talking about her eating disorder. And I just remember her saying this one thing that just really resonated with me, to the point where I wanted to go up there and pick up another desire chip for my eating disorder. And after getting that chip, it felt very different than getting a chip for my substance use disorder, because when I got my desire chip for my substance use disorder, I had so much hope for recovery, because I had witnessed so many other people recover. And it was just like, oh my gosh, I'm going to find this new way of life and new way of living. But after I picked up this eating disorder chip, I was like, what now? Like, I had known so many people who were suffering from an eating disorder. I've seen it in my family, I've seen it in friends, but I've never seen anybody recover. I've never heard the message of recovery. And so I just felt like this was something I was going to have to suffer with for the rest of my life. I was viewing eating disorder in the same way as my substance use disorder, as this chronic disease that I was going to have to learn to live with for the rest of my life. And that seemed so miserable to me that I kind of wanted to die. Like, I didn't want to have to live with the voice of my eating disorder forever. And so I've included some ideas that helped me achieve full recovery to talk about these, because these were kind of like those moments where I had like these epiphanies. And so having hope was essential for me to even getting started in recovery. And it wasn't until a few years later that I stumbled across a recovery program for eating disorders, which is called Eating Disorders Anonymous, that I heard the message of recovery for the first time. And it was online in a Zoom meeting, and women were sharing their message of recovery, and they were talking about fully recovered, like not just learning to live with this eating disorder voice or learning to live with these thoughts. They had fully recovered, and I could hear it in their voice, I could hear it in their story. And so having that hope was essential for me to even get started, because once I knew it was possible, I knew I had something to strive for. Because at that time, I didn't even know what recovery from an eating disorder looked like. And they were describing this ability to be free from their thoughts, engage with other people, feel their feelings without being afraid. And so these were all things I wanted, and I didn't even know I wanted at the time. And so hearing that message of recovery and instilling hope that recovery was possible was the essential first step that I needed. And then I continued to show up to that meeting. And in previous meetings, it was kind of like those 4 stages that Michelle was talking about. Before in my recovery journey, I had been adopting this narrative to tell my story in a way that was fitting other people's narrative. And I was denying a huge part of my story because it didn't fit with other people's narratives. Like, I was trying to fit my story in a box. I was trying to fit the substance use disorder narrative. And I never had a language to describe what was going on with me in my eating disorder. And so when I was trying to carry a message of recovery, it never really, like, I didn't have that light that people saw. Like, it wasn't meaningful to me. And then there was also that part of me that I wasn't really attending to. And so when I started going to those eating disorder meetings and I was able to be completely honest with myself and lean into my own story and use a language that really resonated with me, that was a really liberating and empowering experience for me, because I finally got the courage to tell the truth and be authentic with myself. And that was about, at this time, I was probably about 4 years sober. And I finally started letting go of the pieces and letting go of other people's stories that didn't really resonate with me. For example, like, I didn't think I was born. Like, I would oftentimes hear people say, like, I was born an addict and I saw these symptoms early on as a child. And so I started looking for these symptoms when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I would try to see myself as an addicted child, and that wasn't really my story. Like, I had a really great childhood. I never even used substances until I was into my senior year of high school. And then something significant happened in my senior year where I started using substances and an eating disorder to cope with whatever was going on. And when I started leaning into that story and identifying with my narrative, that's when I started being able to find, like, being authentic and being honest with myself helped me build trust with other people. And that felt really good for me. And then recognizing the milestones, which is our way at the beginning of every meeting, we had to acknowledge what we were doing good and right in our recovery. Like, instead of claiming chips or time in recovery, we would recognize what we were doing good and right in our recovery. And that might be something like eating food we previously restricted, or showing up to the meeting. And that was something that was really hard for me, because I was always really good at looking at what I was doing wrong, because I was a very self-critical person, and oftentimes that would keep me stuck in my eating disorder behaviors, because I was always thinking I was doing something wrong. I was just a terrible person, and I would ruminate about these things. And so every time I would show up to a meeting, I was forced to think about what I was doing good and right. That put me on a path to continue to do those things that were good and right in my recovery. So showing up to that meeting was something good. And I realized, like, this makes me feel good about myself and what I'm doing for my recovery. So I want to keep doing that. And and just being able to continue to make a list of those things that helped me instead of making a list of things that were harming me, put me on a path to create more things that were helping me. And the next thing is, when in doubt, do first things first. I never knew what I needed to be doing, because I would never put myself first. I always felt guilty for doing that. And so that was a mantra they had in Eating Disorders Anonymous, is take care of the basics. And so if I was feeling off, or I just was feeling restless, irritable, and discontent, I would always check in with myself. Like, did I eat today? Did I get enough sleep? Like, did I take my medications? Like, what are my basic needs? And remember the 4 legs of the chair, because they use that analogy or metaphor to talk about like what keeps you balanced in your recovery, in your physical, mental, emotional, intellectual, spiritual needs. Like, those are the 4 legs of the chair. And I had to identify what are in each category, what are the things that keep me balanced, and I need to attend to those things first before I try to go out and help others and try to be all things to all people. Like, I need to take care of the basic needs first, and then I can go out and try to do everything else. And then lighten up, which was so funny to me when I heard a lot of the founders in recovery talk about this, because I thought recovery was such a serious thing. Like, I just needed to keep my head down and like work my recovery program and just like look at all these things that I needed to work on. And I just constantly had this big cloud over my head, and I was just like, had this permanent like sad face. And when they would talk about lighten up and laugh at these things, and I just, even seeing the word lighten up just physically takes this, like, I can just physically feel my body lighten up, and it just allows me to, it just gives me permission to not take this so seriously, because in our active eating disorders and active addictions, it was so painful and lonely and sad. And so for us to be able to move out of that and laugh at ourselves, it's really quite healing. And so I'm really grateful for that. And then this one is a really big one that I always get really emotional about when I'm talking about with the women I mentor, or the students or the clients I work with, because building trust with myself was such an essential part of my recovery. Because when I was in my active addiction and my active eating disorder, I had essentially broken trust with myself, because I had failed myself so many times. My body had failed me. Like, I had betrayed myself on such a deep level. So getting into recovery, I didn't have any trust with myself to do anything. And that was such an emotional betrayal. Like, I didn't trust my body to do what it needed to do. I was so afraid of what I was capable of. And it took years of consistently doing things that was good and right for myself to build this trust again. And it's such a long, intentional process that can't happen overnight. And so that's why I get so emotional, because when that trust was finally built with myself, that's when I experienced this freedom and happiness that no one can really take away from me. And so some of the things that I needed to learn to build trust with myself about is overcoming the food and the weight fear, which we don't really talk a lot about in meetings, because we try to stay away from the food and the weight, because in active eating disorders, we use food and weight as a distraction from what our real problems are. And that's why we don't spend a lot of time talking about it. But in the process of recovery, I had to address these fears, because that's what was so scary for me. I didn't know that I could eat certain foods, and I I didn't know that I could gain the weight back without hating myself. And so for the longest amount of time in early recovery, I really thought that gaining weight would take me back out in my substance use disorder. And so for the longest time, like, I thought my substance use disorder recovery was contingent upon being a certain size and a weight. And so I didn't really think I had true freedom. Like, I just always thought my both recoveries was contingent upon eating a certain way or looking a certain way. And that I never felt like I had anything to offer anyone in any program. And so it took an enormous amount of spiritual and therapeutic work to get to the bottom of, like, can I be who I want to be and eat what I want to eat and still gain this weight and it not kill me? And it was such a delicate process that I was so afraid of for so long. And then and I describe it as some moment where all of a sudden, like, I gained the weight back and I was okay. But it really wasn't some moment. Like, I really felt like I went through this, like, awful breakup with these clothes that I could no longer wear anymore. But it really was like this spiritual experience that I realized, like, I was so much more than what I look like, and I saw myself as more than that. And when I finally broke free from these chains of, like, size and weight and allowed myself to do that work to overcome, like, the fear of weight gain and the fear of eating certain foods, which was a slow process of allowing myself to challenge myself in these ways. And I needed the room to take these small steps. Like, it's not something where I could just say, like, okay, I want to be a person in recovery, and so recovery is eating these things, and if I don't eat these things, I'm no longer in recovery. And so I had to have enough room in recovery to allow myself to take small steps and then move back, take the few steps again and move back again. And so when I finally got to the other side of it and realized, like, these things aren't holding me back anymore, like, I felt resilient and free for the first time in my recovery. And that was a pretty significant moment in both of my recoveries, because the one thing that was going to take me back out is no longer an issue for me anymore. And so that's building trust with yourself, and then allowing myself to feel my feelings too. That was one thing that I was always afraid of. Like, I thought if I felt the depression or the anger, like, I was physically going to die. And so those are some things that I had to be gentle with myself and allow myself to do slowly. And then carrying a message I believe in. And so once I was authentic and true to my story and allowed myself to face some of these things, I had a message and a story that I truly believed in, which is full recovery from an eating disorder is possible. And all of these things that I was ashamed to talk about, like, now my purpose in life and my job and professional career is about carrying a message of both substance use disorder and eating disorder recovery. And I can't find anything more fulfilling than that. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And that message has depth and weight. Like, you can't give away something you don't have. And that gives me so much meaning and purpose today, that the eating disorder doesn't have any ammunition against me anymore. And now I have this positive identity concept that I talk about a lot, because what's most lovable and most valuable about myself has nothing to do with the food or the weight. And so these are some concepts that I try to talk about when I'm working with students or sponsees or clients, that it's so empowering to find your own story that's true and authentic to you. Like I can't find meaning in sharing somebody else's story or what works for somebody else. And I really hope that people can really dive in and find something that works for them, because when they're able to share that with other people, that's what's going to give them meaning and purpose. And that's the essential message that I wanted to share today.
Thanks, Diana. I really always like your story. My story, I got into recovery actually through a collegiate recovery program. And I suffered from anorexia, bulimia, compulsive reading, definitely compulsive exercising, all kinds of things. And I didn't find the program until like my last year of undergraduate school, but I was so grateful that it was there. And I was also grateful at all the people from the community that the recovery center would invite in. I first got into recovery by going to a 12-step Eating Disorders Anonymous meeting that met on Mondays at the university. And every other week, it was a 12-step meeting that was led just by us, the participants. But the other weeks were led by a dietitian who was a certified eating disorder specialist from the community, from like outside the school. And she would come in, she would lead us. And I remember we even went to like some lady's house that had recovered from anorexia. And it was just all these different approaches that I got to see. And I feel so grateful that I was able to build my recovery based on a model where they encouraged me to use all kinds of recovery approaches. I didn't even really get what the Collegiate Recovery Community was. I just knew that I was going to these meetings and I was like going to this weekly meeting that had people from all different addictions. And so I just always saw us as all connected. I did not have a substance use disorder. I was eating disorder only. And so being in that environment, I mean, I understood that there was an abstinence mindset because in our we had materials from all kinds of different recovery approaches. So yeah, I think Eating Disorders Anonymous had just started. So most of our books were actually Anorexics and Bulimics Anonymous. And then we also had some Overeaters Anonymous books. And so some of those talk about abstinence. And so I understood that. And I also went to Overeaters Anonymous meetings like in the community outside of the collegiate recovery community. I just went to ones in town. And so I was sort of introduced to all these different methods of recovery. And in the beginning, my recovery too was really rigid, and it really worked for me though. It helps me to, have to get up and pray and get up and do these certain things, make sure I call someone every day. And maybe I had kind of a food and exercise plan that it was like, this isn't too much and this isn't too little, and I need to follow this. I need to give up, my control over this and give it to a dietitian or give it to whoever instead of me. And so there was definitely an abstinence mindset at the beginning, but ultimately it was about my journey because I went after I graduated school. I'd been in recovery for almost a year, and then after that, I would say maybe 9 or 10 months to a year after being in recovery, I started getting very compulsive about recovery. Like my recovery impulses definitely kicked in, and it's that sort of abstinence mindset where things are. It's the abstinence mindset where if I mess up, everything's going to be ruined, and I definitely developed a fear that I was going to lose recovery if I made even one step wrong. And that, mindset is just as harmful as it's really an extension of my eating disorder mindset, which is a compulsive mindset, which is a worrying, anxious mindset, very controlling and very catastrophizing mindset. And I saw that in a lot of eating disorder recovery programs around me, where people really did think oh my gosh, my addiction is going to attack me and I will die if I make even one slip up. And for me, that has not been the case. I relapsed about 1.5 years or so after I got in recovery, really bad. I entered into a deep depression and had to try to figure it out. I was overseas at the time, came back to the States, applied to be in an inpatient program, and eventually, though, in the process of applying for scholarships to go to that program, I also found a job and I found a therapist and I started going to more support groups, and I started developing sort of my own outpatient treatment program for myself in a way during that time. And it was actually suggested to me that maybe I should try to stick with, what I was doing on this outpatient level for, at least a year and see what happened. And so I had relapsed, but I got back on track through all these methods, going to a therapist, going to like different kinds of support groups for professionally led process groups, and then also supplementing with, 12-step groups and having a sponsor. And slowly I was able to build up again to where I was able to sponsor others. And then I joined different organizations where I mentored other people recovering from eating disorders. And even through that time, while I was mentoring other people, I would still mess up. And there are some people that would say that some of the behaviors I engaged in indicated a relapse for sure. But I don't see any slip up or a relapse as an ending of my recovery. I like to tell people, once that you've found recovery, you can't unfind it. It's not like I didn't learn all those things before I had that relapse. I mean, I got into the program, in that Collegiate Recovery Program, and I still think about things that I learned, during that year and a half, my first year and a half of recovery. And then of course I did relapse really badly, but I didn't have to start from square one. I was never starting from square one again. And so for me, it's been really effective to see recovery kind of like this spiral that's on this slide, where I go up and maybe I go back down a little bit, and I go up and maybe I go back down. But overall, over all the years, it's ended me in a higher place. So even though there's still the possibility that I might have hard times, or that I might hit a depression again, or that I might start having eating disorder thoughts, I never have to just give up. And for me, recovery is really about not so much sustaining this rigid abstinence or something like I have to keep my abstinence at all costs. It's about letting myself fail sometimes, or seeing myself fail sometimes, and maybe being sad about that, but getting back up the next day or the next minute and being able to live in recovery. And the more time I have in recovery, the more quickly I'm able to make that transition from, oh no, I messed up, to I'm moving on, and have less guilt about it. That's a thing that only time has been able to do for me. And well, time and the practice of getting up again and again. And I've seen so many people, when I've mentored people over the years, and in myself, feeling really confused about the fact that I'm in eating disorder recovery. I know what I should do to recover. I know all these tools, and yet I'm still failing. And I think a lot of people in our collegiate recovery communities are in that position, where they're new to recovery, and maybe they're in a substance use program, and the eating disorder program is baffling because I have to encounter food every day. I don't know what to do about it, and I have to do it all the time. And so of course I'm going to fail. Like, I can be a wonderful, perfect recovering person for, 23 hours out of the day, and then in maybe 5 minutes, suddenly I've binged and I've ruined my life or something. Like, I think people have that thought. And the only way to take the ammunition out of that eating disorder, like Diana was saying, to take the ammunition out of those slip-ups, is to remind myself, to remind my mentees, that we can get up and just keep going. Like, we don't have to feel guilty. Like, our eating disorder wants us to feel guilty about stuff like that. But we don't. We can keep moving on. And again, keeping track of abstinence seems to help a lot of people in the beginning. Like I said, I had to just ask a dietitian, what should I be eating? Ask people who knew more than me, how much should I be exercising? Go by their prescriptions and tell my sponsor things, and tell my other people, tell my therapist things. Being, knowing that I had, not binged in a month was very motivating for me in the beginning, but later it did become a compulsion. And that's the thing that for this presentation, I think we're kind of centering around, is we don't want people to feel, in eating disorder recovery, to feel guilty just because they're not doing recovery perfectly, because no one does. So, I think that's all I really want to share about my story right now. Is there anything else you want to share with anybody, Diana? Or do we want to move on to our resources?
Yeah, let's just go ahead and move on to our resources. On this slide, we hyperlinked a bunch of eating disorder resources, whether you are a staff member, student, professional, I want to highlight the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals. If you are a Collegiate Recovery Program staff member who a lot of people don't have funding to hire a specific eating disorder professional in the Collegiate Recovery Program. And so collaborating with professionals in your area may be a better resource. And so finding people who are specialized in eating disorders is a great alternative, and that's where you can find somebody. And then like I was sharing in my story, I didn't know of any eating disorder resources when I first got started as a student. And so if you are wanting to direct students to specific resources to get their recovery journey started, a lot of these 12-step groups offer Zoom meetings that they can go to, and they also offer step meetings and sponsorship through online formats. And so that's a great resource to offer your students. And then we also included the Texas Tech Center for Collegiate Recovery Communities, where you can get a hold of our staff members who are specialized in eating disorders. And you can also see our recovery curriculum on there. And then Health at Every Size and Intuitive Eating, reading about those principles is really helpful. And then we've included our email addresses. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Since this is a pre-recorded webinar, we didn't get the opportunity to interact with you guys, but we would love to answer any questions you have regarding this presentation, or just anything that came up for you as we were sharing research or our stories. This is something that we're both really passionate about, so please email us any questions you have.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Michelle, you go on.
I was just saying thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so everybody heard, if you have any questions, please email. You've got the email addresses there. I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate you being able to do this. As I mentioned, it will be uploaded to YouTube, and we'll provide links to everybody who is registered for the conference or presented. Thank you again, and I wish you goodbye.